to Decision Makers. I'm Charles Ellison, your executive producer and also host. We have joining us now State Senator Kevin Parker. He represents the 21st District, 21st Senatorial District in the state of New York. Go to nysenate.gov for more information. He also chairs the Energy and Telecommunications Committee, which is very busy these days for the New York State Senate. He's joining us now here on Decision Makers. Senator, always good to see you.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me, Charles. I appreciate it.
Excellent, excellent. So, the role of the state legislator, I often think about how public thoughts and perspectives on state legislators like yourself can often ignore or discard how important that role is. A lot of times people will confuse state legislators or state senators with yourself, for example, with U.S. senators. They forget about their state capitals, like in Albany, and how important that is. How do we fill that void or that civic literacy gap when it comes to knowledge about state legislators?
Yeah, no, you hit it on the head. It really is a issue of civics. It really is about us doing a better job at educating the public. I think that one of the hardest jobs for state legislators is communicating with their constituents, right? They elect us to be in the state capitol half the year. And then when we're in the capitol half the year, they're like, where are you? We never see you. It's like, because I was in the state capitol doing what you elected me to do, right? And so having a good communications team is really critical, using your franked mail to educate voters and the people in your district is critical. But we really, from an educational perspective, need to do more classroom work around having people understand what the different levels of government are. Maybe we should be running those little PSAs again about "I'm just a bill." I think that would help
for the state level.
Yeah, for the state level, exactly, right? Because everybody, I guess Congress is sexy, right? So everybody kind of pays attention to that. They watch CNN and Fox and these, stations, and that's what they are getting exposed to, not really understanding that literally most of the things that people are concerned with, education, housing, healthcare, public protection, transportation, are really dealt with primarily on the state level, far more than they're dealt with on the federal level.
Yeah. So, talk about like your leadership roles now. You chair the Energy and Telecommunications Committee. You also play some other leadership roles in the New York State Senate. You even do work with organizations like Council of State Governments, for example.
Right.
You're chairing that Council on Communities of Color. So how do these types of roles from where you're standing shape business in the legislature? How does it mold and influence the business that's done there?
Well, in state legislatures, typically seniority is the name of the game, right? So the biggest thing about like my leadership is I've been here 21 years. In the New York State Senate, where there's 63 members, I'm number 4 in terms of seniority in the entire body, right? And so that's given me an advantage, not just the knowledge of what's going on before now, but also essentially having, to a large degree, my choice of kind of assignments that I want to have. I've been on the Energy and Telecommunications Committee for the entire time I've been here in the New York State Senate. And I've been either the ranking Democrat or I've been the chair of the committee the entire time. And so that's given me an advantage in terms of understanding these issues around energy and telecom. I also am the majority whip in the New York State Senate, which is kind of a fancy term for the fact that I'm in charge of what we call democratic discipline. Which, you're laughing because I know it's an oxymoron to talk about democratic discipline.
Right.
But it's, my job to kind of help line up votes, to take kind of account of where members are on various issues, and to help the leader as she builds consensus around things that we'd like to see get done. And so those roles allow me to shape policy. They allow me to be involved in important conversations. And they allow me to get bills passed because I know where members are. And so as I'm drafting legislation, or as I'm trying to get it pushed in certain bodies, that part has been important in terms of kind of understanding what I can get votes for and what I can't. But most importantly is the relationship part of it. You know, relationships are primary, all else is derivative. And so building relationships with my colleagues and using those relationships to advance not as my agenda, but their agendas as well. Like, you know, thinking win-win and figuring out ways that we can work together to make our state better and our communities better.
You know, I don't tell you that we're in the middle of a governance crisis nationwide. You know, you're in the middle of that storm, you know, in a state capital like Albany, right? And challenges abound in places like Albany or on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., or, you know, you talk every now and then, I'm sure, with your colleagues in other state legislatures. So, you know, you've got, you know, these different challenges that are piling up. You've got budgetary challenges. You've also got challenges back in your district that you've got to also face or deal with. And then you've got challenges like, you know, what recently happened, like, you know, a state like yours has to occasionally deal with disasters like what recently happened with the bridge collapse in Baltimore. That state legislature has to be activated. But there's this polarization and racial animus that's getting in the middle of a lot of this these days. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that. How do you navigate it all?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that you hit the nail on the head. That is really a dichotomy, right? And the first part of it is the multifaceted nature of being a state legislator, combined with the fact of dealing with competing priorities, right? And so it's not just dealing with a disaster, but you're always dealing with getting people access to healthcare and to housing, making sure that police protection, you know, is happening in a way that's dignified to the community. It's, you know, is making sure that we have, you know, resources in the place that we need to have resources for our young people, or for, you know, increasing Black women's maternal health, right? And so we're dealing with all of these things kind of simultaneously. And then I look at the crisis really more from a federal level and a state level, where, you know, there's no help coming from afar, right? There used to be a time, even early on, if I go back to my beginning of my my service in the state legislature, where like you could look to the feds and get help for things. And now, because of the breakdown of civility, you know, in Congress, it's difficult to get federal money for anything, right? And if the president can't do it by acclamation, is really difficult. I mean, you even look at what's happening with Ukraine, and you look at what's happening in Israel. Like, you can't resolve these things or even get a solid position. And the basis of that is turmoil, you know, about race relations. I mean, quite frankly, you found you know, a candidate in Donald Trump who has weaponized race relations, and to a point where you know, white people who are, you know, really should be lined up with Black people on economic issues are seeing them as enemies instead of allies, in terms of, you know, making sure resources are brought to all of our communities, right? Because there really is enough. But he has folks believing that, you know, they're losing their country. And so, you know, they would rather give up an ability to have, you know, economic success and more prosperity in this country, you know, to satisfy their penchant to see, you know, Black people oppressed and other people oppressed as well. But, you know, you kind of start with Black people and work your way up from there. And so it becomes a real problem. And I think it's made state legislatures more powerful, frankly, but it's also made us more insular in terms of just trying to make sure that we're taking care of things within the bounds of our own states. And I don't think that lasts forever, because obviously some of the things that you're seeing around the Supreme Court certainly have impacts across state lines. And so, you know, it's also forcing people to pay more attention to that as well.
What then do you have like that good governance definition? Like, do you have sort of like a set of tenets or like fundamental principles like that guide you each day, like, you know, sort of like 2 or 3 tenets, or
yeah. So
like
for me, a lot of it is the greatest good for the greatest amount of people. Right? The greatest good for the greatest amount of people is kind of the first thing that I kind of you know, work off of. The second thing that I kind of pay attention to is, how do you create win-wins? And I think that for me, it's a little bit, that's both process and outcome, right? Because it's a lot, what allows you to kind of get to a place in which you can work with your colleagues in a way that's collaborative, in which they see a win out of your success as well. So it's kind of codependent success, as I like to call it, right? And then really the third thing is kind of do no harm, right? And like the do no harm principle is kind of, just trying to make sure that the things that you do don't have unintended consequences. Or if you're looking at something, and even if it helps some group of people but makes everybody else worse, then it's not really a good outcome for you, right? So you really want to just do things that bring good into the world, and again, does no harm to others.
I'm real curious with your work on the Energy and Telecommunications Committee. We're faced with a climate crisis, and that presents multiple environmental crises, while we're hoping to usher in this full transition to clean and renewable energy to help us with that crisis, right? So just wondering how you're managing all that, or what that looks like for you. I mean, it's something that, energy is a big topic, and it's a very important topic, especially for big states like New York. What's your committee up to as it relates to especially that transition that we're going through from fossil fuels to clean energy?
Yeah, so about 5 years ago, we passed something called the CLCPA, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act.
Okay.
And that has become the ruling guide for how we deal with both energy and environmental policy in the state of New York. And so since then, I really have felt like it is incumbent upon my committee to implement policy around making those goals successul. And so those goals are primarily environmental goals. I run an energy committee that's related, and so we've had to work on some things that we believe are goals in the energy sector that align with the CLCPA, right? In adjacent to the CLCPA, I also passed a bill that same year in that same session called the Environmental Justice Review Panel. And that Environmental Justice Review Panel is to make sure that we have equity built into the system as a intentional and inherent part of all the decisions we're making on the environment. And so that's really, really important. So we've done a lot of really important things last year. We passed a bill that we refer to as Cap and Invest that really creates some economic disincentives for people to reduce carbon, whether in their daily lives or within commercial activities. And then we also did something called Build Public Renewables Act, which essentially gets involved our state power agency called the New York Power Authority, involved in building sustainable energy resources. So the major kind of goal I feel like we have right now is really twofold. The first is actually keeping down cost of energy, especially because of Putin's war in the Ukraine, has really raised the global price of energy, particularly gas. And so, finding ways to reduce our costs around utilities has been a big piece. And then the second piece is building clean energy generation resources and building clean energy transmission resources in the state of New York. It's really only by, getting more, solar, wind, hydro, cogeneration, that we're going to really, battery storage, energy storage, that's really going to be the path for how we build out this clean energy economy. And then related to that is, workforce development. If you listen to Van Jones and the book he wrote early on, The Green Collar Economy, you understand that, if we don't really take advantage of this as a Black community and Latino community, that this is going to be our next best opportunity to build full-time jobs at a living wage with benefits. And so it's really important that we engage, understand what those jobs are, where those jobs are, and prepare our community to take those jobs.
So how do you, on issues like that, they can be, they seem practical, right? But they can be so controversial, and then they end up being so divisive because of that polarized climate we were talking about a few moments ago. Like, how do you then collaborate with your peers on the other side of the aisle on issues like that?
Luckily, in New York, that's less of a problem because
Mm.
Democrats, kind of rule the roost around here. So
Right.
we have Democrats up and down the ballot, and so the governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, um, state controller, both houses of the legislature are all controlled by Democrats. And so
Mhm.
it's a little bit more, we're more aligned. And so we're not arguing about climate change. We all kind of agree that climate change is something we need to address. It's now, how do we get there? And frankly, that's an easier conversation than the former. All right. And so we're not doing a lot of debating on whether um, climate change, needs to happen. We're not really doing a lot of debating around whether building a clean energy economy is necessary in the state. The question is like, how do we build the road ahead? Right.
Mhm.
So it's a different level of a conversation. And we really are looking to be leaders in the country on clean energy development and developing a clean energy workforce in our state.
Bro, and last question here too, Senator. What do you think those next set of big issues are for the state of New York? I mean, I guess you also have to think in terms of your district, the next set of big issues for
Mhm.
a district like District 21, Flatbush primarily. That's where you are, and
Right.
Brooklyn. So, what do you think are those next big set of issues as you're looking like 5, 10, 20 years ahead?
Yeah. I mean, to be honest with you, I think as a state legislator, you kind of you you look you think globally and act locally. Let me say it that way, right? And so I think about, when I think about issues, I do obviously pay attention to what's going on in my district, but I'm, also extrapolating those issues, the things that are happening citywide and statewide, right? Living in the largest city in the country and living in one of the most important, if not the most important state in the country, right? And so when I'm looking at these issues and I'm saying something like, building, clean energy jobs, I know that's important for the state, but I also know it's important for the people in the state of, in the district that I represent.
Mhm.
We have a huge, influx of migrants that we're trying to address, and some of them have been located in my district. I think how we address this issue around immigration, although a federal issue, has local and state implications, and addressing some long-term policies about how we address the migrant crisis is, I think, a critical part for us. Again, housing connected to that is huge. Although we're in the midst of negotiating our state budget right now, part of what's going to happen in that budget is probably a housing plan that's going to deal with both building more housing and making sure that we have tenant protections as well. And I'm hoping that we'd find some space to really map out ways to encourage more home ownership, and not just white picket fence, traditional white picket fence home ownership, but also non-traditional home ownership, and allow people to have equity in the places that they live. And so, you have multiple kind of issues happening at the same time. Access to education continues to be an issue, and just being vigilant around issues like a woman's right to choose. Even though we're one of the safest states in the country, protecting a woman's right to choose, you have to, again, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. We are the third most safe state as it relates to gun violence, but we continue to, again, be vigilant around that and do even more. We like to be number one, and we like to have a year when no one was killed by a gun, right? And so, looking at alternatives to violence, looking at issues around access to daycare is huge. Addressing the issues around young people. I've been one of the champions around the issue of universal after school. Now that we've talked a lot and done a lot in the state of New York around universal pre-K, universal after school is the next best thing we have to do to engage our young people and our communities to make sure that we're reducing things like gun violence, all right? Because we understand a lot of that gun violence is coming out of gang violence, right? And you reduce gangs by giving young people something else to do. And if we're not engaging them, then the streets are going to, and then that's when we wind up with problems. So, there's the quote, one of my favorite writers, Haki Madhubuti, out of Chicago. He says, in a book from Plan to Planet. He
Mhm.
says the problems of Black people are multifaceted. Thus, we must be multifaceted. We must be multi. He said the problem of Black people are multifaceted. Thus, we must be multi-talented
Mhm.
to address those issues. And so it's these, again, back to this issue of competing priorities. But all of these things have to happen. And so we need affordable housing. We need good access to quality education. We need after school daycare. We need job opportunities. A clear path for immigration. And so it's not a singular notion, but really an agenda that has to be followed in order to address the issues of all of our communities. And although you hear me a lot talk about Black and Latino communities, I don't think that those dynamics are unique to our communities, right? I think they're unique in almost every state that you're dealing with, that my colleagues in other states have this same issue of dealing with competing priorities and dealing with multiracial communities, multi-ethnic communities, in which how you address those issues and how people engaging those issues may have particularly cultural context that must be addressed as we look to serve our communities.
Right. We've been talking with New York State Senator Kevin Parker. He represents the 21st Senate District in the state of New York, which is Flatbush and in Brooklyn in New York. And you can go to nysenate.gov to learn more about that. He's also chair of the Council on Communities of Color at the Council of State Governments. Also, don't forget, he serves a very important leadership position there in the New York State Senate as Majority Whip. He's been joining us here on Decision Makers. I'm Charles Ellison. I'm your executive producer, also host. Want to thank the Council of State Governments Eastern Region for their partnership and helping produce this. Also, Learn for Life's Civic Literacy and Media Influence Institute and the Smart Services Coalition. We'll see you next time.